And so, all right, I'll go ahead and get started. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. This is our first fall speaker series. This fall season, we're going to be taking a look at regional restoration, ecological restoration, and habitat connectivity. All of our events and speakers are going to be focusing on that and different successes and some of the great stories that are happening around the region. I'm going to be putting a link in the chat. We're going to be having some great upcoming events this season. So I'll put that link for our events page so you can take a look at that. And hopefully you'll join us at some of the other ones we're having later in this season. And just a few housekeeping items before I dive in and introduce Jeremiah and get started. Just remember to stay muted while we're doing the presentation. If you do have any questions that pop up during the presentation, Jeremiah is going to be doing some pit stops along the way. And so if anything pops up, you can ask him then. If you don't want to forget the question, you can go ahead and type that into the chat. And we can, field that once we get to that pit stop. And I think that's it for housekeeping items. And this is recorded for everybody's information. And so that will be posted on our YouTube page once the event is over. And okay, I think that's it. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Jeremiah and Cuenca Los Ojos, which is what we're here to learn about today and explore. So Cuenca Los Ojos is a 121,000 acre protected area in the Sky Islands of Sonora, Mexico, located along the border of the United States and Mexico. The CLO stewards a very unique desert wetlands and very unique habitats that are located in the Madrean Archipelago. They do this through the restoration of and rewilding of the ranch lands through the reviving of natural processes such as fire, pollination, predation, and herbivory. So today, CLO is the home, once again, of some of these amazing species that used to roam these areas, such as jaguars, ocelots, black bears, and beavers, and a whole host of other threatened and endangered species, including some plants as well. So we're very excited to hear from them. And now let me introduce our speaker for tonight. I'm so excited to have him here. I want to introduce Jeremiah Leibowitz, who is the Executive Director of Cuenca Los Ojos, and he oversees both the US and the Mexican organizations. He's originally from San Antonio, Texas. He started in the private law practice and focused on water law and farm and ranch real estate law. From there, he actually served as the director of the Gulf Coast Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Unit for Texas A&M. A little bit of a long title there. The Texas A&M's University's Natural Resource Institute, which involved the managing and research cooperative of 12 federal agencies and 50 university and NGO partners throughout the Gulf Coast from Texas all the way to Florida. Prior to being in CLO, he served as the conservation director for the California Rangeland Trust. So we're so excited to have him here tonight to speak about CLO and give us an overview of all the amazing work that they've done over the years. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to him and get this started. Thank you so much, Jeremiah, for joining us.
Great, Anya. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and good evening to everyone who is who's tuning in for. I didn't realize I was the first speaker of the fall series, so they're going to do really well, and it's going to be a series you come back to, or yeah, I'm going to do very well. We'll leave it at that. No, good night. I see a handful of names that I recognize that are tuning in tonight. So again, thank you for your time and joining us. So in speaking with Anya, she came across a very small presentation on a panel I did for the Arizona Association of Conservation Districts. And from there reached out and asked if we'd be able to present on this regional restoration idea using CLO as an example. So real briefly, Cuenca Los Ojos, I always get asked, what does that name mean? It translates to watershed of the springs. This region that I'm going to talk to you about tonight, historically, pre-European settlement timeframe in the northern Sonora desert area, were historic wetlands or cienagas. And over time, just through natural processes, land use, human occupation, animals, climate issues, the whole gamut of uses of this landscape became very degraded on a number of different levels. And approximately 30 to 35 years ago, the founder of our organization, a lady named Blair Clark, started to acquire this landscape. These were private lands prior to them transitioning into a nonprofit. And her premise was simply, I've got a degraded landscape. How are we going to figure out a way to restore plant and animal life? And in her mind, the foundation of all life started with water. And for all of us who live in this region, we understand how our rain season works, the intensity of the rain events, and the challenges with rain and water hitting a landscape. If it's unprotected, in other words, it's relatively bare with very little cover, the likelihood of that energy and that water washing off the landscape is pretty high. And that's essentially what she found on these lands, like I said, approximately a little over 30 years ago here in Mexico. So I'm going to start working you through. Let's move into our agenda. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through the kind of the location of where these lands are situated. I'm going to go into more detail about the water component of our restoration work as the foundation for the entire preserve. And I'll talk briefly about how we are now a preserve, okay? I'm going to briefly touch on some programs and projects just to give you a high-level overview of some of the work that we're engaged with. And I'm also going to talk about a handful of challenges that we as managers, land managers, are currently faced with and are having to adapt to in our management process and our revisions of our management plans as we move forward. And then I'll talk a little bit about where we're headed. And my goal will be, with Anya's help, I'll try and take a pause kind of between these major subject matters so that if you do have a question, you don't have to wait all the way till the very end to talk about something that, was maybe near the beginning of the presentation, okay? All right, let's see here. Okay, so let me just I'm going to give you 2 quick slides just to orient everyone of the landscape, where we are, and some of the natural forces that are in play in terms of where we're situated, okay? So this first one is just really big, broad brushstroke. It shows you the Sonoran Desert, shows you the Chihuahuan Desert, coming up from the south, the Sierra Madre Occidental, the Colorado Plateau. I mean, these are big, land forms and topographies that are all coming together right about where CLO is situated. On this particular slide, I've generally depicted it by that red rectangle with the word Sonora in the middle of it, okay? Then you can see in the inset, just again, where we are. We're at that bottom 4 corner area between Sonora, Chihuahua, Arizona, and New Mexico. Okay, this slide here drills down a little bit further to show you the footprint of the preserve that we manage. And again, just for orientation, let's see if you can see my cursor there. Okay, so we have a couple of things going on here. One, the border that we share with the United States is approximately 30 miles long. And it stretches, again, the southeastern part of Arizona and the southwestern part of New Mexico. Again, orientation as to who's kind of our northern partners, our northern landowners. We do have some federal agencies with the San Bernardino National Wildlife Refuge. Not depicted here, but for those familiar with this lower part of Arizona, a lot of lands that are part of the Malpai Borderlands group are represented in this region of Arizona. You can see the Gray Ranch, which is another large preserve and protected area on the northern side here in the Animas Valley of New Mexico, okay? Unique to where we are in Sonora, a couple of things. One, we share some watersheds that flow north to south. So water, again, coming back to the foundation of the organization is a big deal, not just for how we manage it on the south of the border, but what those potential effects could be to our partners on the north, okay? We also, you see this little piece right in here, a neighboring parcel of the preserve that we manage, not directly part of the preserve, but a neighbor, and as part of the landscape, folds right into what we do, and that's called a ejido. And in case anyone's not familiar with what that means in Mexico, in general terms, it's a communal land ownership mechanism by where indigenous folks in Mexico are given a plot of land, and they can be pretty large, but then they manage them as a community, right? And a lot of times the livelihood that they earn is derived off of the resources of these lands. So we incorporate them into our process. We do our best to try and the things that we do on our preserve from a management standpoint, we have to be mindful that our neighbors are looking at us. We have to be aware that if we want this landscape to be restored and be protected, then what we do needs to be cost effective. It can't be exorbitant, and it has to be replicable for others to hopefully adopt it, assuming that it works in their landscape. Okay. So we're going to jump right in to talking about water and just some of the restoration mechanisms and management tools that we use. None of these, we didn't create any of these, but I can represent that we have been able to put these together at scale as Anya introduced. The preserve is currently 121,000 acres, and by and large, I'd say probably about 70% of it in different forms either has what I'm going to talk about here, these trinchetas, or the larger structures, gabions, that you'll see a slide of here in a second. But what's the objective here? Again, at the end of the day, slow water down. For us, the foundation of everything in the restoration process of these lands is water. Well, when this preserve was started in kind of a unique part of our history, is that about 35 years ago when our founder started acquiring these lands, she did all this as part of a private family foundation. This was her endeavor. This was her restoration work. This was funded by her. And as part of the transition to ensure that this landscape had some longevity and could be protected in perpetuity, within the last 3 years, that private family foundation has transitioned into a 501c3. So now we've got our mission and our objectives are still the same, but how we operate is slightly different, okay? But taking the foundations that she started with, what we're trying to do here is very simply slow water down. Throughout our preserve, we have all kinds of washes, all kinds of drainages, areas where when we get those monsoon rains with the intensity, they'll hit the ground, and if there's nothing to slow them down, they as everyone I would imagine has seen here in the desert Southwest, water will rush downhill with an amazing amount of force. And so I talked earlier on about the bare ground, right? And what we're trying to accomplish is the rain event. The objective behind this loose rock structure is simply to slow water down, not to block it, because water is going to permeate through this structure, but ultimately then we increase the sedimentation behind these structures, creating a much better soil profile that at the end of the day, plants and grasses and better riparian species are able to take root, restoring the bank, restoring the riparian areas, and a whole host of benefits start to build upon this one foundation of slowing the water down in these riparian areas. Okay. The other thing we tried to accomplish in this landscape is, as you can see, there's a lot of rock laying around this landscape, and so the goal is to use the materials that are available to you. Very costly, obviously, if you're working, let's say in the United States, trying to develop some sort of restoration project. Maybe you don't have the materials on your land. Maybe you have to truck them in. All of a sudden, these things start to cost a lot of money, and it doesn't become a cost-effective endeavor. So again, back to the point I made about trying to see if the management practices that we're employing can be replicated to our neighbors and elsewhere, really around the world in similarly situated landscapes. It's got to make money sense. It's got to make economic sense. Okay. So using resources that are on the land readily available is key. Now, on a much larger scale, this is just representative of a gabion. Okay. Again, throughout our entire watershed, the different draws and creeks and riverbeds that we've got, there are some structures. What you can take away from this photo is the incision of the bank in this particular part of this creek is huge, right? Over time, just continues to get cut, continues to get washed away. The objective behind this, now granted, this is not a very cost-effective process. Hiring labor to build these baskets, to bring all the rocks, to this again is a very large endeavor. And moving forward, as we strategically assess where we need to put these, we are in a position where we are going to be needing to raise money to implement a larger watershed restoration plan. But we have a large number of these already on the preserve. So what can you tell here? You've got a spillway. You can see the size. You know, this bank here, the incision from the very top of the bank to the bottom is somewhere between 20 and 30 feet. So it's pretty significant all the way across. The length of this thing is probably, could be anywhere from 30 to 50 yards, depending on the size of the water bed that we're working in. Okay, but ideally, and I'm going to show you, I've got a handful of pictures to show you that if this works correctly, if we've engineered it correctly, and we have a significant rain event, I'm going to show you some examples of what things look like if things go well, but I'm also going to show you when things don't go well, because they don't always go well. And we've definitely had, through trial and error, more errors than successes. On the whole, it averages out. But recognize that as I make this presentation to you, I don't want it to come across that, hey, what we're doing is fantastic. It's the best thing since sliced bread, because every landscape's different. But we also have experienced some setbacks on some pretty grand scale. So, and I'm going to share some of that with you. Okay. But again, before I go to the next slide, just showing water is going to be coming in over here where you can see my cursor kind of going back and forth on the left. We have a spillway in which to allow that water not to just completely cut away at the bank in the bed, but to somehow gradually work its way over the landscape. Okay. So if it works, let's see here. There we go. Make sure it comes up on your screen. There we go. Okay. So if it works, this is essentially what we're hoping for, right? So on the left side of your screen, you can see where the water would be coming. The gabion, that rock structure, and this is not the same location as the previous slide, but that you can see the outline of where the gabion would be. Okay. And then on the right side, you also see how sedimentation is filling up, which is representative of the fact that even further downstream, there's another erosion control structure that is helping to again, stair step the energy of the water throughout the watershed. So if this happens, compared to what I showed you on the last slide, we're starting to reduce the depth of that incision on the bank, right? You're starting to see sediment, like not just gravelly rock bed, but soil, sediment, a good soil profile for plants to start taking root, grasses, good riparian species that can stabilize the soil. The other thing that is not very visible in this picture, but is happening, is that the profile of the soils that get laid behind these gabions also end up acting as a sponge. So there's a significant amount of water that's able to be retained in the soil profile across the entire riparian area for longer amounts of time over the course of a year, right? So as opposed to just having the monsoon season and then the rain comes and goes, what we've seen over time is the fact that by implementing this type of management practice, in some cases, the creeks and the rivers flow for longer periods of time, but we also identify that we have water staying on the landscape, helping with the water table a lot longer than it used to prior to these sorts of restoration efforts. Okay, the next series of slides, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on them, but they're just going to be examples of some simple before and after restoration work. Okay. Unfortunately, one thing we're working on as we go through our backlog, not backlog, but our inventory of photos, because we have an amazing amount of photos of all of our restoration work. But we need to time, put the dates on when these pictures were taken, the befores and afters, so it can give our audiences and folks that we share this information with an idea of what the length of time is between the recovery following the various treatments that are put in place. Okay, so again, I'm going to work through. I think I've got about 4 or 5 of these before and after type shots, just to show you the successes. Right. So here's the Cajon Bonito. You can see a lot of gravelly rock bed. When it does rain, again, an amazing amount of water at high velocity just rushes through the landscape. Okay, we've gone in and put gabions in this riverbed. That bottom picture on the right shows you that after several seasons, when you're able to slow that sediment down and create some soil stability for plants to take root, you start to restore those riparian areas, which then can absorb that energy in future rain events. Okay. Oops. Here's a picture of Silver Creek, and I'm going to talk to you about Silver Creek in a little bit later. But again, on the left side, that gravelly soil, very, very steep incisions on the bank. What you can see, and these areas are comparable, where I'm circling my cursor. This on the top left, that tree right there in the middle of your picture is the same one as you see on the bottom right. Okay, but the bottom right, what you can see is, look at the difference in the soil composition in the stream bed. Very rocky and gravelly and deep on the left, and already we're starting to get some really good sediment getting settled, and also we're decreasing the depth of that incision. You can start to see grasses coming in here in the bottom right, that again, over time, the idea is that it's gonna retain soil moisture. It's gonna provide stability for the soil. And oh, hang on one second. Okay. And allow us to keep water on the landscape a lot longer. Okay. Show you one other example of a riparian restoration. Then I've got a picture of some grassland restoration work, because that's also a component of some of our management strategies. This here is black draw. Again, here, what you kind of see, but in some riparian areas, what we do pole plantings. So we'll take willow poles from some of the trees that are already existing in the riparian areas, and we'll do those plantings across parts of the bank over time. Again, you can kind of see on the right side, this is in the same location, what that can do once you can stabilize the soil and not allow that water just to rush through the landscape. Okay. All right. In addition to riparian work, again, all of this with the foundation of water in mind. Our topography is very varied, from lowland valley areas all the way to very mountainous, rocky terrain. But another significant part of what we were trying to do on the preserve is reestablish the native grasslands that were there historically. And so this is just an example of some management practices whereby we left the control on the left-hand side. To assist with this process, there was some cattle grazing that took place. I'm going to talk briefly about that a little later in the presentation. But regenerative ranching and high-intensity rotational grazing is a component of our management strategy. And in this instance, you can see in the bottom right, there was some native grass. All of our whole objective about the landscape is to go native, right? So we're looking at reintroducing native grass species, plants, animals, the whole spectrum. We're doing our best to reduce the imprint of invasives and enable the landscape to regenerate in its native form. Okay, so here we did do some grass seeding, some native grass seeding as part of this particular example. Okay, all right. So I've got 2 more slides before I take a quick question break. The next 2 I'm going to show you, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, that not everything goes according to plan, right? And we're dealing with Mother Nature. The force of water that comes through this landscape is tremendous. And so I've got a small video that is recent, within the last month, following a rain event that took place in Silver Creek. So there was a significant water event on the US side, and the water came south. And what you're going to see here, and I may pause it. I've got 2 still frames after this, but there's no sound, so don't worry too much, except for the gentleman filming. It says a couple words at the end of it. Let me get over here. Let me play this for everyone real quick. Looks like there might be a little delay on the video.
Está derrumbando todavía el paredón.
Okay, I'm not sure how well that came across just due to the bandwidth on y'all's end, but let me move forward to the still pictures that I have here just to demonstrate for you. Oops, let's see. Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is just to demonstrate, this is Silver Creek. The video that was shot was just showing kind of the full breadth of the water that came through. But this is a pretty large gabion. You can see how it's 3 high. These baskets are about 4 feet high. And so there's 3 layers, so that's 12 feet going across a stretch that's probably 50 to 60 yards. But the force of the water coming through here, one, you can see on the picture on the left, just kind of like it was a rubber floaty of some kind. It just moved the wall, moved this entire gabion. And keep in mind, these are all connected. These are all linked together to create that structure and stability. But then you can see on this picture on the right how the creek just completely eroded the bank to the left of this structure and completely went around it. So again, we are aiming to restore riparian areas. We are aiming to use trinchetas and gabions, but we're also dealing with, Mother Nature gets a vote. And so one of our processes going forward now with technology is going to be implementing more spatial assessments of our watershed so we can strategically place or repair gabions when we encounter this type of damage. Okay. Now, why is this important? Because again, in this particular instance, this was water that came out of the U.S. And flowed south, running east to west. And I didn't have a really good picture of it, but running east to west, just parallel with the U.S.-Mexico border, is Highway 2, Mexico's Highway 2, which essentially runs, from Agua Prieta, runs east and then heads south down into Chihuahua. It is a 2-lane highway for all the traffic that has to go east to west in northern Mexico. This particular flood almost took out the bridges for that highway. And so when we look at what kind of restoration and management practices as it relates to watersheds, it's not just water that we're having to contend with for the preserve's sake. We also have some larger issues that we have to account for. Whereas, if there was no sort of mitigation or no sort of watershed protection on the lands that we manage, we could be affecting international commerce, at least as it pertains to Mexico. And so again, we have a lot of partners in Mexico that we work with on these sort of restoration projects, again, to try and mitigate some of the larger damage that could occur to their infrastructure. So it's pretty dynamic. Okay, Anya, let me, I don't know if you're getting any questions, or let me just take a breath and pause there. And I'm happy to field any questions that folks might have at this point.
Well, I'll go ahead and open it up. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and shoot it out. Or you're welcome to type it into the chat and I can read it out loud for you. But yeah, I'll leave a couple minutes. I have 1 or 2 questions myself. So if anyone doesn't, I can go ahead and ask those too.
Well, Anya, why don't you go ahead while folks are possibly teeing up their question?
Yeah. So do you know what year this flood was?
Yeah, this was this year. So these particular pictures that I just showed, this occurred about a month ago. And in a second, I'll talk a little bit more, once I get into a couple of the challenges. But this was a this year flood.
Wow. That's an impressive amount of water. That's a little scary too.
It is. It's frightening. It's frightening.
Is, yeah. And then the other question kind of relates a little bit to the native plants. I was wondering, I know you said you did some pole plantings in some areas. In order to, kind of increase that biodiversity, do you all do any seeding, or do you kind of let things happen naturally, after the sediment starts building up over a space? Kind of how does that, Yeah,
that's a great question, Anya. And so aside from the pole, it depends on how bad, how bare the landscape is in the particular area that's getting restored. Generally speaking, when it comes to the grass part of things, we'll let Mother Nature do her thing. There's enough seed coming in the sediment that gets deposited in these areas that it can kind of, take care of itself. In other locations, more on the grasslands where we're not going to have that kind of sediment deposition, that's where you'll tend to see us do more of our native seeding.
Awesome. Let's see. Oh, we do have a question from Alma. What kind of spatial data do you use? And then how do you assess where to place the structures or which ones to repair?
Alma, that's a great question. And so let me kind of back up a little bit. When these structures were initially put in place, the timing of them and just kind of the idea was you go out and you look at the watershed and I wouldn't say it was a Kentucky windage. There was definitely a lot of thought put into it, but we just didn't have the technology that we do now, like GIS analysis, to model and map these watersheds. So when I say we're using spatial, all of this type of technology, quite frankly, is new that we are going to start implementing in the development of a kind of a holistic watershed strategy. So we work with a number of folks in Mexican universities as well as U.S. universities and some federal agencies who have that mapping capability. For instance, USGS has been a huge partner of ours historically, and moving forward, they've done all the LiDAR analysis. They know the watersheds, and so we are going to actually start sitting down with watershed experts, folks that do this for a living, to answer the second part of your question. Where do we put them? There's some things I'm going to talk about in the challenges part of my presentation that is causing us to reassess where we need to put future gabions and future erosion control structures, and whether or not, for instance, taking a look at this one in Silver Creek, whether or not we are actually going to come back in and repair this. It may not be economical and it may not be the right answer based on new modeling. So again, historically, we have not implemented the use of certain technologies, but it is part of our strategy going forward. It's kind of a long answer, but I hope that addressed what you were asking.
That was great. Thank you, Jeremiah. I haven't gotten any other questions. As always, if you do think of something, even from a past session, please, type it into the chat. I think, we got one more from Ashley. How much does
Ashley, I was hoping I didn't get that question.
Oh.
But no, I'm talking about economics. I'm talking about this stuff being affordable. And so, Ashley, thank you for actually asking that question, because the short answer is this. We have not yet done the full economic analysis for me to be able to tell you what this would cost in the US, right? Keep in mind, we're working in Mexico. Our labor rates in Mexico are a lot lower than what they are in the United States. And we have the significant amount of material that's there. Obviously, the wire baskets we have to bring in. The best answer I can give you right now, actually, I'll have to follow up with you as it relates to the gabions themselves. But if I were just to give you a ballpark, if you go back in my slide presentation, to just that little trinchera, I'll call that a small to medium size trinchera in Mexico, from a labor standpoint, that would cost about $100 US to build. Okay, so again, comparing it, it's kind of apples and oranges on the labor rates. I do know that the gabion materials in the US are going to be significantly higher than they are going to be in Mexico. But Anya, I'm assuming you kind of keep track of who's attending these, and what I'd like to do is follow up with a better answer for Ashley and for the group that can be sent out.
Definitely.
Thanks for asking that.
Yeah, we can definitely add the follow-up email to everybody. And we do have one more from Alma. How did you get community buy-in for these structures?
Yeah, so you bring up a good point, Alma. So community buy-in, the challenge, or not the challenge, but the reality was that at the time these were done, these were all done on private land in Mexico. So our founder owned these privately. It was her ranch land, and she went in and started doing this. And so, but what became important, and where the buy-in is important, is back to where I talked about the ejidos, our neighbors, the communal lands that are adjacent to us. At first, here's a great example, right? I mentioned that we use cattle as part of our regenerative ranching program and grazing as a tool. However, when she first started, she took all the cows off. And it wasn't because she was against cows or against ranching, or Sonora is a very strong agricultural and cattle ranching part of the world, but it was merely a management practice to let the land rest. So of course, all the neighbors, there's credibility here that's at stake. They're like, here comes this lady from the United States, right? And and all of a sudden she has no cows and she took them all off. How the heck am I going to listen to what she has to say, right? But so it took time. And so over time, we've reintroduced the cattle. They've observed that our watershed restoration practices have benefited them, not just by giving them more water, but also mitigating damage, right? Just, as some of these pictures have described, the whole landscape is affected by these rain events. And so the community buy-in, I would offer, Alma, over time has been kind of, the proof is in the pudding, right? You obviously cannot go down there and work with these communities and come in with a holier than thou attitude and say, well, you guys should be doing this. These folks have been here a long time. They've been living and working these lands for a long time. So it's a give and take, and it's showing by doing and seeing. Let them see the results. Let them speak for themselves, and if it's something they want to adopt, and we're all about trying to help them do that.
Thanks, Jeremiah. Okay, so we have 2 more questions. I'm going to stop there for questions afterwards, and we will have another couple pit stops. And again, you feel free to keep dropping those in there. How do cattle impact your work in your landscape?
Yeah, so cattle, as I mentioned, are a huge part. And so keep in mind, we're not in the cattle business, but we use cattle as part of our management strategy on a number of different fronts, right? And I'll talk a little more detail about this a little bit later in the presentation, but some high level points are simply the high intensity rotational grazing. We have about 20 vaqueros that work and manage this preserve. They are on horseback every single day. We've got a handful of vaqueros that are assigned to managing the herd and essentially moving them around. We've got paddocks established with electrical fencing. So it's really a tool to disturb the soil, chew the grass down so that it can stimulate the growth, deposit the manure and urine as fertilizer throughout the landscape. But even another component that maybe not a lot of folks consider, but we also use the cattle herd in grazing as part of a fire mitigation strategy, right? We've got a lot of grass that during the drought became dry. Well, we are not, again, we prefer to use fire as a management tool. However, in the case of a drought, the challenge is that if something does catch fire out there, it becomes catastrophic, and all of a sudden we're back to ground zero with bare ground, right? And so we have to control fire if it's not started by us. And one mechanism that we use to do that is cattle grazing, because it helps us maintain the right fuel load across the landscape. So I hope that helps answer your question, Alma.
Thank you. And then one from Danielle, before we move into the next section, is the land open to visitors?
Yeah, great question. So the short answer is it's not one that you can just show up and say, hey, like a national park and drive in. However, we do host groups, and whether they're groups of birders, students, researchers, we try and clump them together and schedule them. Simply, one, for a safety factor. This is a very wild landscape, and we want to ensure that we've got the staff available to escort these groups around. So if there are folks on this call that are interested in the future on getting groups out there to see this landscape for a variety of reasons, we can definitely help accommodate those types of requests.
All right. That's all I have for now. I did put the link for CLO if anybody's interested, but I think we can move on.
Okay. All right. How are we doing on time?
We have a little bit less than 20 minutes.
Okay. All right. I think we can move through the rest pretty steadily. Okay. So what I wanted to spend a little bit of time on is talking through some of our projects and programs. Okay. So, and I think this is that question about, is the place open to visitors? Good segue into what I'm going to talk about here. So we've got a lot of partners in the border of other nonprofits that are working in the borderland region, right? You've got the Sky Island Alliance, you got the Northern Jaguar Project, you've got Borderlands Restoration Network. All these organizations are partners of ours. And the unique place and the unique role that CLO fills in this landscape is simply, we have the land, we've got the laboratory, we've got the outdoor space that a lot of these other groups can work with us on in order to implement some of their programs, right? So an example here was one where we worked with the Borderlands Restoration Network out of Patagonia on developing a Sonoran field course. So we are really big in supporting efforts that work to get the youth of the region engaged in the ownership and the restoration of their home, right? So the majority, this was COVID threw a big kink in our plans. We're recovering and we're starting to get back on track. But this was our first iteration of this course with 8 students from the Sonora area, right? And they spend about 4 days out, it was a full week out on the land, camp. It's facilitated with class sponsors. And then some of our staff, who you see here, Jose Manuel Perez is the gentleman in the brown shirt in the center photo there. He's our conservation director. He manages all operations for this preserve in Mexico. And he's flanked there by a gentleman named Gerardo, who is essentially a technician and works directly with Jose Manuel. But they're giving a class to students, right? And then the students in the top right, this is part of we're working with Bat Conservation International as part of an agave propagation program also with Borderlands Restoration Network. One for the pollinating aspect of agave and it being a native species of plants in this part of the world. But there's also interest in trying to figure out how, from an economic standpoint, is the use of agave and the planting of wild agave, could that be part of a sustainable agave harvesting industry for bacanora, which is a distilled alcohol that is derived from the agave plant. So the Sonoran Field Course, again, just one example where we do bring students out. We can bring researchers out and expose them to what we're doing as part of our restoration program, okay? The other thing I mentioned to you is we're doing a lot of work with native species, right? So fish, we have because of all the water that we have now been able to get back on the land, whether it's in some of our lakes and some of our ponds or even through some of the river systems. This is just an example of one of the fish biologists, Dr. Alejandro Varela, holding a yaqui catfish out of one of our ponds. They were able to collect 7 of them, and they're being moved to a fish hatchery, whereby additional, the goal is to breed them and then be able to reintroduce them back into the landscape, most likely back on the lands that CLO manages. So we're not throwing trout and bass, and everybody always asks me, hey, can we come fishing down there? And I'm like, well, if you like the yaqui catfish, be my guest, right? But there's no sport fishing. These are all native species and endemic species that we're trying to reestablish. Okay. Another thing that we're working on, and this is a new project for us. Okay. There's a very reputable conservation finance group in Mexico by the name of Fundo Mexicano. And they're a huge partner of ours. And they recently hired CLO because our bread and butter is land management and land restoration, to partner with them on managing a ranch that's down in Chihuahua. So way further south than us, about a 2-hour drive south of us. Totally different landscape, completely flat. I'm going to show you a picture here in a second that shows you what Rancho La Luna looks like compared to these pictures I've showed you of CLO. But why is this important, and why do I bring this up? Well, as part of this other preserve, Rancho La Luna, there is a herd of bison, an introduced herd of bison, the objective of which was to use bison as part of the grassland restoration program. And as you can imagine, there's a ton of interest of bison in the U.S. and quite frankly, internationally. One, because of it being just the species of bison and the importance in the history of the landscape. But interestingly, and kind of one of the challenges that we're finding out is in Mexico, bison are considered wildlife. In the US, you have management ability to treat them as livestock. You can buy them, you can sell them, you can harvest them. In Mexico, you can't do that, right? And so we are working with the Mexican government and all the environmental organizations in Mexico, because we're in a situation where we've got a landscape that can only hold so many bison. And because we can't manage them in the traditional sense, we have a population that is starting to tax the landscape that it is on. So it's a fascinating challenge. It's a fascinating project. We're going to continue to work. The grassland restoration piece is huge. Back to a question we got about, hey, can you go down there? we can definitely host groups down at El Luno. It's a different landscape, but if you're, people are interested, both from an ecotourism and education standpoint, that is part of our programmatic offerings that we are working on developing. And if we have successes in developing a way in Mexico that we can manage this herd, we also believe that there's some very upside impacts to the local economy and in terms of what we can do with these bison. Okay, one other quick picture. So this is the landscape of El Luno. I mean, it's just totally different. I mean, as far as the eye can see, grasslands. And so we don't have the riparian areas. We don't have the water like you saw me talk about in the earlier part of the presentation. Most of it is groundwater. We do get rains, a smaller amount. And I failed to mention that on average, we're in a good year, if we do get rain in this landscape, in the CLO landscape, we can get anywhere from 12 to 15 inches of rain a year. But that's what we get. And so we've got to maximize that resource. Okay. But again, this is really just to represent the scope of the land management activities that our organization is involved in south of the border. Okay, now we're going to kind of get into some meatier stuff here. I talked earlier about just talking about the challenges, right? And I would imagine everybody on the call is very familiar, with what's been taking place on the southern border as it relates to the border wall. This is a new thing for us. This is a very challenging management problem on a number of fronts. As you can see here, the wall cover goes through a lot of really rough terrain. A lot of this terrain was disturbed severely to construct it. Whereas before, we talk about in this space that Mother Nature doesn't recognize, man-made political boundaries, right? Where water goes, where air goes, where animals go, boundaries are immaterial to them. Well, this is a little different, right? Because we have a physical boundary that is 30 feet tall with very narrow spacings that does inhibit connectivity, that does inhibit species migration, that used to occur at a much larger scale. We're also concerned it's still new, right? Because as that mentioned to Anya, that flood just occurred. And that was our first flood event with the wall in place. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that here in a second. But erosion, all of the work that was done to construct this wall created some really concerning potential erosion events when we get these monsoon rains. And so again, we're still at the very forefront of what this impact. We have an idea of what those impacts are going to be, but we've got to monitor the landscape. We've got to see how it responds to Mother Nature, and then we've got to adapt our management practices to account for this new barrier. Okay, so one thing I'm going to talk about is flood, because it was recent. So if anyone on the call has not made it to go see the wall, you can actually drive on the U.S. side and drive most of the length of it, through Arizona, and even get out of your car and walk up. And this picture is taken on the Mexico side, looking north into the U.S. Okay, so I mentioned earlier we have about a 30-mile border with the U.S. And there's about 8 or 9 different drainages or big washes that occur throughout the course of this wall portion. Well, as part of its construction, the Army Corps of Engineers and the powers that be determined that, well, the way we're going to mitigate against flooding is we're going to create these gates. We're going to create these openings periodically in those areas that could really flood. So this was done. These gates were open right before the monsoon season started. This is in Silver Creek. Okay. Not all the gates along the wall were open, only certain ones based on weather predictions. But some interesting things to take away here. One, you got the gates facing north, and they were either chained together or they were welded together to keep them open. But keep in mind, that's private land, private ranching land on the north, and then our grazing land on the south. So the key was, well, let's throw up some barbed wire to at least keep the cows from going north to south. One of the benefits, as you can imagine, by having these gates open, though, is that animals were able to start going back and forth the way they used to, which is critically important, because in certain parts of this landscape, the natural watering source for these animals is in the U.S. side, specifically in the San Bernardino National Wildlife Refuge. Okay, so they would migrate north to south through the preserve, CLO's preserve, to their watering hole and back. when the wall came up, we had to bring online on our preserve a number of wells and wildlife waterers to make up for the lack of access for wildlife getting to their watering source. So again, just those challenges I talked about that we're having to learn how to work through. I'm going to show you the after picture of what happened following the flood. Okay, so now this picture is on the north side. I'm on the U.S. side. Look at the same spot, same location, but now I'm looking at the gates, and I say we CLO that took these pictures. Most of the gates are facing south, right? Their chains and their welds that were meant to keep them open to the north, completely broken. Majority of these gates broken off their hinges. A handful of gates that you can't see, about 4 to 5 of them actually washed down into Mexico, and we haven't been able to locate where they are right now. So it just goes to show that just the volume of water that could be coming through this landscape is enough. I mean, the wall is not gonna stop it by any stretch of the imagination. What I don't have here, I forgot to include, is just an after picture. Let me back up here. So you can see the level in this picture here of the stream bed. Okay, and I've got a picture I failed to put in the presentation, but following these floods and due to the velocity and just the energy of the water coming through, this part of the Silver Creek bed is cut down another 6 to 8 feet. And then it goes downstream. And if you'll recall those earlier pictures that I showed you of how the Silver Creek washed out around that gabion, this is all part of the same watershed. Okay, so the energy came out of the north, worked its way through, through the gates. Significant amount of erosion occurred. We've got damage to a gabion downstream. So this is a new challenge for us. Back to an earlier question I got about, the spatial technologies and where do we put gabions? We've not had to deal with this type of a structure in the landscape before. And we're just now learning and going to start monitoring how, what kind of impacts it's going to have. And as I said, this was an isolated event to Silver Creek. There are 8 to 9 other locations throughout the preserve's border, and we'll just have to monitor those and see what sort of impacts the construction of the wall and its effect on the watersheds has. We don't know. We don't have all the answers just yet. But I know there's a full spectrum of feelings about the wall. Obviously, we don't believe that this was the right solution for the issues that were brought up. At the same time, we're respectful because we do recognize, even for our lands and for our neighbors to the north, security is still an issue, right? We want to make sure that if folks going north, if that is a concern for folks, that is a real issue that we understand needs to be addressed. And it, believe it or not, it actually affects us on the Mexican side as well, because in certain areas, folks do use the preserve to transit. At the same time, is there a middle ground in this dialogue that's occurring about this borderland region and the wall, to where we can accomplish the security objectives that are on the forefront of many people's minds, while also finding some middle ground to enable migration, to figure out ways to mitigate damage from water events. I can represent that there's a significant amount of dialogue going on, both with entities on north and south of the border, trying to have some productive dialogues to address these issues. They're not easy. Obviously, they can be very complicated, and in many cases very emotional. But we believe that where the rubber meets the road, we have a preserve on the ground with a very large border that's shared with the U.S. and believe we're in a good position to participate in that dialogue and hopefully come up with some solutions. So let me move forward. Okay. And then here's an example, 3 pictures that just kind of show what we caught on game cameras, wildlife, once the wall went up, trying to figure out where to go. These others are just ones that we are collecting as part of a pretty robust camera trap monitoring program that's being worked on. Again, just wanted to show a quick snapshot of a variety of the wildlife that we see on CLO. Okay, so where we're headed. a good picture just to demonstrate a certain extent of our cattle grazing process. We've got our herd moving through some grasslands and getting into some of the cienega areas. Got some brushland on the left-hand side of the picture there. But let's talk about where CLO is headed, and some of these things I've discussed throughout today's presentation. What's really going to be big and important for us moving forward is using science and data to inform our management decision making. Up until this point, as a private family foundation, all those types of tools were not brought to bear on the project. Where we are now as a full-on nonprofit, and part of our funding and part of where our partners are going, absolutely critical that science and data inform our decision-making process. And to that end, we're actually developing a full preserve-wide monitoring protocol to enable us to implement our management strategy. I mentioned partnerships. I've got a slide coming up after this that basically just gives you a quick snapshot north and south of the border, U.S. Mexican entities. There's just a whole scope of disciplines that are coming to work in this landscape, and obviously without partners and colleagues in the area, we could not get this work done. I talked briefly about regenerative grazing. That's a huge component of what we do. Fire management as well. Spend a lot of time on the riparian restoration. Wildlife reintroduction. By and large, as we work through these building blocks of restoring the riparian areas, watching the plant life come back, and then starting to see the species from insects to birds all the way up the food chain start to reintroduce themselves. There are a handful of species that we are probably going to need to help reintroduce, such as the Bighorn Sheep. Historically has been part of this landscape, and then over time, for a variety of reasons, it doesn't make its way onto these lands. So we're going to be looking at some much larger game type animals that will be reintroduced. Another big one that we're paying attention to, and actually have a couple of conversations coming up later this month, relates to climate change, carbon sequestration. How is a landscape of 121,000 acres going to be able to maximize our management protocols in such a way that we could help the climate, take advantage of the economics behind potential carbon sequestration and carbon markets and carbon credits. It's still very early on in Mexico. We're working with Mexico, the US, and Canada to understand how this North American market could benefit a lot of these restoration efforts. So again, it's a new project that we're engaging in, and I expect easily within the next 3 to 5 years at a minimum, these programs will be up and running, and we fully anticipate that we will be able to participate. And then in response to the access to the property, right? Assuming we can all make it past COVID healthy as best we can, and travel restrictions open up and folks can move freely across the border, we definitely anticipate that we're going to increase our education and ecotourism offerings. I can give you this presentation here tonight, but the impact that is really felt is when you actually get out and can experience the landscape for yourself. And we hope to expand that component of our programmatic offerings here in the future. Okay. I mentioned our partners. Here they come. So just a quick slideshow. Tried to capture just about everybody that we could, but again, U.S. federal agencies, Mexican nonprofit agencies, research university, private foundations. I mean, it runs the gamut, and everybody that's represented on this slide over the course of our history has participated in some way, shape, or form, with our preserve.
Awesome.
And Anya, we will call that a presentation.
All right. Well, I know we're a couple minutes over, but if anyone has any questions, this is going to be recorded and up on our YouTube. So if anyone, I know someone had to run, but I actually have two quick questions. And actually there is a comment as well in the chat about invasive species from Gita that, let me see here. that there's buffalo grass starting to come in to the right side near this photo when you were talking about Silver Creek and the border wall. That was perhaps brought in by construction machinery on the US side. And so I kind of wanted to just hear a little bit about your thoughts on invasive plants and maybe just a little bit of that challenge and impact that, you know, any thoughts on that end. And my last question is, what type of cattle do you all manage and have on the property?
Okay, so let's see, invasive in cattle. Okay, so on the invasive side, yeah, definitely a management challenge. You know, in some areas, the native species are in a much better, you know, in a healthier state. We tried to use the cattle as a mechanism to mitigate certain invasive species, to create an environment for the natives to kind of take, you know, not have as much competition. Very seldom, if at all, will we do any sort of like mechanical treatment for removal. That's not something that the founder has been very keen on. And I don't know, maybe in certain circumstances, it may be part of our strategy going forward, but on the whole, we try and figure out a natural mechanism, a natural process, restoration process that will enable us to reduce the invasive footprint. But they're there. There's no question they're there, whether they came from construction equipment or they were, you know, one time a lot of this land was, you know, back in the day was farmed, right? And so where they come from is anybody's guess. There's a variety of avenues that they've gotten on the landscape. But we find that through the restoration process, once the natives have an ability to get a foothold, you know, they're at some point there's a tipping point, right? The balance kind of gets back in equilibrium, and we've had some pretty good success on, I wouldn't say fully eradicating the invasives, but definitely minimizing their impact. And then on the cattle question, real quick, I'll be honest, Anya, I should know that, but I don't. It's not a particular breed. We breed for characteristics. You know, the demeanor, the calmness of the animal. Also the body size is critical, just given the landscape. We're looking for animals that can sustain themselves in a desert environment, that are able to easily give birth. You know, we're not doing any sort of genetic experiments or trying to go for a you know, a pure breed type of herd. It's really got to be a type of animal that can survive on the landscape, and also process in their rumen, right? That it comes down to what can they do with the forage that's available on the landscape. So it's more characteristics driven than it is breed driven.
Right. I come from a cattle family, and so I just wondering, but thank you. I don't see any other questions that have popped up in the chat, but
sorry, I ran over.
No worries. All right. Well, I think we'll go ahead and call it a night. Thank you everybody so much for joining us. Thank you, Jeremiah, for this great presentation. Yep. Thank you, everybody. We will have this up on our YouTube. Thank you for joining. And yeah, we will be sending a bit of a follow-up email. I know, Jeremiah, you wanted to get back to Ashley's question. And so we will send up a follow-up email with a link to the YouTube and answering some other details. So, all right. Thank you everybody so much. Have a great night. Let me go ahead and stop this recording, and I'll go ahead.